What happens when an entire civilization crosses a line so dark that heaven itself must respond? Long before mighty empires wrote their names in history, two cities sparkled like jewels in a green valley. They were rich, powerful, and beautiful. But beneath their gleaming towers, something terrible was growing. The ground itself was crying out to God, and He was listening. If you're ready to discover how one man's faith changed everything, and why this ancient story still shakes the world today, hit that like button and subscribe to Bible Breakdown Hub. We're here to uncover the truths that transform lives, one biblical story at a time. The desert wind was hot that day when it all began. Abraham stood on a dusty hill, his weathered hands shielding his eyes from the blazing sun. His gray hair danced in the breeze as he stared toward the horizon. This wasn't just any old man watching the sunset. This was the man God had called to leave everything behind and follow a promise that seemed impossible. Years earlier, God's voice had thundered through his soul like lightning. Abraham, pack up everything. Leave your hometown, your family, your comfortable life. I'm taking you to a land I'll show you. Trust me, and I'll make your name great throughout all nations. Abraham had done exactly that. His faith became his compass, and his obedience became his path forward. But he wasn't traveling alone. His nephew Lot walked beside him, a young man whose eyes always seemed to be calculating his next opportunity to get rich. As time passed, their flocks multiplied, and their servants grew in number. Success brought a new problem. Abraham's shepherds started fighting with Lot's shepherds over grazing land and water rights. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. One morning, Lot approached his uncle with a proposal that would change both their destinies forever. "Uncle Abraham, this isn't working. Our people are at each other's throats every day. The land is huge. Why don't we split up? You go one direction, I'll go another, and we'll both have room to prosper." Abraham, wise beyond his years, nodded thoughtfully. "You're right, nephew. We're family, and family shouldn't fight. Look around you. See all this land stretching in every direction? Pick whichever side looks good to you, and I'll take what's left." Lot's eyes immediately turned south, where a lush valley spread out like a green carpet rolled across the desert floor. The Jordan Valley was paradise on earth. Rivers flowed through it, crops grew thick and tall, and right in the heart of it all stood two magnificent cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. Their towers reached toward the sky, their gardens hung like emeralds from terraced walls, and their markets buzzed with the wealth of nations. "I choose that valley," Lot declared, pointing toward the glittering cities. "That's where my future lies." Abraham simply smiled and watched his nephew gather his tents, his flocks, and his dreams, heading straight toward what looked like the promised land but was actually a trap waiting to spring shut. After Lot disappeared over the horizon, Abraham found himself alone under the vast desert sky. That's when God's voice came again, softer this time, but just as powerful. "Abraham, lift up your eyes. Look north, south, east, and west. Everything you can see, I'm giving to you and your children forever. I'll make your descendants as countless as the dust of the earth. If someone could count every grain of sand, only then could they count your family." Abraham dropped to his knees right there in the dirt. Tears streamed down his face as a golden shaft of sunlight broke through the stormy clouds above, falling directly on him like heaven's spotlight. This was God's signature on an unbreakable promise. Meanwhile, Lot was walking through the gates of Sodom like a celebrity entering a red carpet event. The wealthy citizens applauded his arrival, curious about this rich newcomer from the desert. The men were handsome and proud, the women were stunning and vain, and everywhere he looked, golden idols stood on street corners like spiritual stop signs pointing in the wrong direction. Every night, the cities threw parties that would make modern Las Vegas look tame. Pleasure was their highest god, and they worshipped at its altar with religious devotion. But Lot, still carrying some of his uncle's faith, tried not to see what was really happening. Or maybe he saw it clearly and chose to ignore it. Back in the wilderness, Abraham was building stone altars wherever he camped, creating monuments to the one true God. One night, as he prayed under the stars, he noticed something troubling. A thin column of smoke was rising from the southern horizon, barely visible in the darkness. Something was already burning in those distant cities, even before judgment fell. Evil was consuming them from the inside out. Abraham closed his eyes and whispered a prayer that pierced the night sky. You are perfectly just, God of heaven, and you are also perfectly merciful. Down in Sodom, Lot was fighting a losing battle to keep his integrity intact. He was like a man trying to stay dry while standing in a hurricane. His daughters came home every day with stories of what they'd seen in the city squares. His wife was becoming more fascinated with the luxurious lifestyle, trying on expensive clothes and jewelry while giving him looks that said, maybe we should just fit in. Not everything here is evil, Lot, she would say, while admiring herself in polished bronze mirrors. Maybe we need to adapt to survive. But Lot wouldn't respond. He'd just walk outside and stare north toward the hills where he knew Abraham was still talking to God. The nights in Sodom stretched on forever. Parties raged until dawn. Children were taught to mock goodness. Elderly people were treated like garbage, and justice had been banned from the courtrooms like a criminal. High above, invisible to human eyes, angels were already walking through the streets, taking notes on everything they saw. The time for God's patience was running out, and the weight of coming judgment was building like thunderclouds before a tornado. One dawn, Lot woke up with his heart pounding and his hands shaking. In his dreams, he'd seen fire raining from the sky and heard screams echoing off stone walls. He looked at his sleeping wife, then at his daughters in their beds. Something massive was coming, something bigger than his worst nightmare. In the distance, Abraham was also waking up. His eyes turned toward the south and then toward heaven. The sky was starting to move in ways that made the hair on his arms stand up. Dawn was coming, but so were the footsteps of the eternal judge. Heaven would not stay silent much longer. The morning sun rose over Sodom like a reluctant witness, its golden light barely touching the city as if even sunlight hesitated to rest on those walls. The streets, still filthy from another night of wild parties, were filling up again with mocking laughter and hurried footsteps. There was always a rush to sin in Sodom, as if people were afraid they might run out of ways to rebel against heaven. The markets opened with luxury goods from distant lands. Women wearing gold jewelry and painted faces flirted openly on street corners. Children ran between the merchants, copying the vices of the adults like it was a game. The whole city pulsed with vanity, lust, and cruelty. Lot watched from his window, his heart heavy as a stone in his chest. He kept trying to believe there was still hope for this place. His daughters, now young women, watched the city girls with fascination. His wife spent more and more time with the local women, learning their ways and listening to their gossip. When Lot prayed, his voice seemed to disappear into a spiritual void. That same morning, a few days' journey away, Abraham was sitting at his tent entrance during the quiet hours of the day. The morning breeze was gentle and cool. Suddenly, he looked up and saw 3 men walking toward him. There was something extraordinary about them. Their faces were calm, but their presence carried an authority that made the air itself seem to hold its breath. Abraham ran to meet them and bowed down to the ground like he was greeting royalty. "My lords, if I've found favor in your sight, please don't pass by without stopping to rest." He quickly ordered his servants to prepare fresh bread, roasted meat, and cold milk. The 3 visitors sat in the shade of his trees while Abraham stood nearby like a respectful servant. Then one of them spoke with a voice that seemed to reach directly into Abraham's soul. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" "She's in the tent," Abraham replied. The visitor's next words hit like lightning. "I will return to you at this same time next year, and Sarah will have given birth to a son." Inside the tent, Sarah was listening and laughed to herself. She was way too old for babies. The visitor immediately asked, "Why did Sarah laugh? Is anything too difficult for the Lord to accomplish?" That's when Abraham realized these weren't ordinary men. They were angels, and one of them was the Lord himself in human form. When they stood up to leave, they looked toward Sodom, and the Lord's expression became as serious as a storm cloud. "Should I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah has reached my ears. Their sin is incredibly severe. I must go down and see if their actions are really as bad as the reports I've been hearing." Abraham's heart started racing. He stepped closer with a mixture of fear and compassion. "Will you really destroy innocent people along with the guilty ones? What if there are 50 good people in the city? Won't you spare the whole place for the sake of 50 righteous people?" The Lord looked at him with eyes that could see the future. "If I find 50 righteous people in Sodom, I will spare the entire city for their sake." Abraham pressed on. "What about 45? Or 40? 30? 20? Each time, the Lord agreed to spare the city. Finally, Abraham asked, "Please don't be angry if I speak just one more time. What if there are only 10 righteous people?" "I will not destroy it for the sake of 10, the Lord promised. Then the angels left, and Abraham was alone in a silence so deep it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. He stared toward the valley in the distance, where the sun was climbing higher and making the plains look so peaceful. But he knew heaven was about to respond to earth's crying. Meanwhile, in Sodom, Lot was sitting at the city gate where judges gathered, leaders made speeches, and laws were declared. Lot tried to influence decisions with justice and fairness, but his voice was always drowned out. The men of the city tolerated him only because he was useful to them. They didn't see him as a stranger anymore, but they sure didn't see him as an equal either. That late afternoon, 2 different men walked through Sodom's gates. Their clothes were spotless, their faces were peaceful, and their eyes shone with a fire that no human being could contain. They walked with confident steps, and even the street dogs went silent when they passed by. Lot saw them immediately and recognized what they were. These were not ordinary men. He stood up, bowed respectfully, and said, "Gentlemen, please come to my house. Wash your feet, eat dinner, and spend the night. You can leave safely in the morning." They nodded and followed him, but the city had already noticed them. When night fell, like a dark blanket over the houses, the sound of footsteps began echoing through the streets. Men from every part of the city, both young and old, surrounded Lot's house. Their faces were twisted with blind desire and evil intent. "Where are the men who came to your house tonight?" they shouted. "Bring them out so we can have our way with them." Lot stepped outside and closed the door behind him, his heart hammering like a drum inside his chest. "My brothers, please don't do this evil thing." They mocked him loudly. "Get out of our way! Who do you think you are to judge us? You came here as a foreigner, and now you want to tell us how to live? We'll treat you worse than them." They pushed forward, trying to break down the door, but suddenly a brilliant light exploded from the entrance. The angels pulled Lot inside and slammed the door with supernatural strength. Outside, every man was struck blind. Confused and stumbling, they bumped into each other, shouting and swinging at shadows, unable to find the door they'd known so well just moments before. Inside the house, one of the angels stared directly at Lot. "Do you have anyone else here? Sons-in-law, sons, daughters? Get them out of this place immediately, because we're going to destroy this city. Its outcry has become great before the Lord, and he has sent us to destroy it completely." Lot's face went white as fresh snow. The time for mercy had run out. Lot rushed from his house with hurried steps and a heart full of terror. The darkness of the night pressed down on the city like a death shroud. Every shadow seemed to be watching him as he ran through narrow streets, dodging drunks who were still staggering after their parties. He pounded on his sons-in-law's door, waking them from their sleep. "Get up right now! The Lord is going to destroy this city. We have to leave immediately." but the young men just laughed at him. One of them chuckled loudly, while the other spun a wine cup between his fingers. "Destruction, Lot. It's too late for nightmares and too early for ghost stories. Go back home. We'll talk about this tomorrow when you're thinking clearly." Lot tried desperately to convince them, but their doors slammed shut in his face. Alone in the empty streets, he ran back to his house with his heart breaking. When he entered, the angels were standing ready for action. One of them reached out his hand and commanded, "Quickly! Take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here so you won't be destroyed along with the punishment of this city." But they still hesitated. Lot's wife was trembling with fear. The daughters were crying. Lot himself was shaking like a leaf in the wind. So the angels grabbed them by their hands and pulled them outside, because the Lord was being merciful to them. As they crossed through the city gates, the sky began to roar. Thunder tore through the heavens like a blazing sword. High above, light began descending. But this wasn't ordinary fire. This was divine judgment in its purest form. One of the angels shouted urgently, "Run for your lives! Don't look back. Don't stop anywhere on the plain. Flee to the mountains so you won't be consumed." But Lot was panicking. "No, please. Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you've shown me great mercy by saving my life. But I can't run to the mountains. I'd die on the way. Look, there's a small town over there. It's tiny and insignificant. Please, let me escape there instead." The angel looked at him with understanding. "All right, I'll grant you this request too. Hurry to that town because I can't do anything until you've reached safety." The sun was starting to rise, and the sky that had been purple was now filled with glowing embers. When Lot and his family finally reached the small town of Zoar, the world behind them was about to collapse completely. That's when it happened. Flames fell from the sky like rivers of liquid fire. The ground shook so violently that mountains trembled. The towers of Sodom split in half and crashed down. The walls of Gomorrah crumbled like sand castles hit by ocean waves. The fire of judgment licked through houses, markets, and temples. Screams echoed through the valleys, but no one was left alive to hear them. And in the middle of all this destruction, Lot's wife stopped walking. Just for a moment, she turned around and looked back. Her eyes were searching for something. Maybe it was her friends. Maybe it was her past. Maybe it was all the beautiful jewelry and luxury she'd left behind. But in that look, there was more than just curiosity. There was attachment to a world that God was destroying. Right there, in front of the flames and the raging sky, she was transformed. Her body hardened and froze in time, her eyes still open and turned toward Sodom. She became a solitary statue of salt on the burning plain, a monument to the danger of loving the world more than obeying God. Lot fell to his knees in horror. His daughters screamed, but nothing could be done. From above, among the fiery clouds, the angels watched in silence. God's judgment had been complete and perfect. In the hills to the north, Abraham woke up to the thunderous noise. He left his tent and ran to the top of a hill. From there, he could see smoke rising from the valley like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. His eyes filled with tears as he prayed silently. The Bible tells us that the Lord remembered Abraham, and for his sake, he saved Lot from the destruction. For days afterward, thick black smoke kept rising, a constant reminder to the world of what happens when evil goes too far without repentance. Zoar, the small town where Lot had found refuge, became a place of silent shelter. Its people looked with amazement at the burning horizon, not daring to ask what had really happened. There were rumors and whispers, but nobody was brave enough to go near the devastated plains. Lot was drowning in grief and couldn't stay there much longer. The stares, the whispers, the memory of his wife turned into salt. Everything was an unbearable burden. His daughters walked around silently with their eyes fixed on the ground, lost in their own trauma. One morning, Lot made a decision. Let's go to the mountains. Even Zoar isn't safe anymore. With just a few supplies, they climbed into the hills until they found shelter in a lonely cave far from everyone and everything. The silence was deep, and the nights were cold. There was no laughter anymore, just painful memories. Lot's daughters, traumatized by the destruction of everything they'd ever known and believing that the whole world had been reduced to ashes, began to fear for the future of their father's family line. The older sister said to the younger, "There's no man left on earth to marry us in the normal way. Let's get our father drunk and sleep with him so we can preserve our family's bloodline." That night, they got Lot so drunk he didn't know what was happening when the older daughter lay with him. The next day, they did the same thing with the younger daughter. Both of them became pregnant by their father. The oldest daughter gave birth to a son named Moab, who became the father of the Moabite people. The younger daughter's son was named Ben-Ami, who became the father of the Ammonites. Even after God's judgment, the consequences of trauma and corruption continued to echo through history. The sin of Sodom had been destroyed, but its impact still rippled through the lives of those who escaped. In the scorched plains where the valley cities had once flourished, silence now ruled like a king. No birds flew overhead, no grass sprouted from the ground. The soil was blackened and cracked, soaked with the fire of divine judgment. It was as if time itself had abandoned that place, leaving behind an open wound between the hills, an eternal witness to God's anger against sin that refuses to repent. Meanwhile, in distant regions, other peoples were hearing rumors about what had happened. Trading caravans passing through Zoar carried stories of destruction from the sky. Some said the gods were angry. Others claimed a prophet had cursed the cities. But few people dared to mention the name of the Lord, the God of Abraham. Abraham, back in his tent, was deep in thought and prayer. He watched the sky, and even with the weight of the tragedy heavy on his heart, his faith remained rock solid. God had spared Lot, but the memory of the cries that had risen from those cities stayed with him like a scar on his soul. The lesson was burned into his spirit. The righteous person walks with God, even when the whole world is lost in darkness. Up in the mountains, Lot was aging quickly. Life in the cave was harsh, just like the condition of his soul. He was completely unaware of what his daughters had done to him. His days were just about survival, and his nights were haunted by memories and regrets. The man who had once sat among city judges making important decisions now lived among rocks and silence. His daughters raised their children far away from civilization. Moab and Ben-Ami grew up like wild children without experienced mothers to guide them, without culture, and without proper direction. The seeds planted in desperation would grow up to become nations that would rival Israel in the future. Even good intentions, when mixed with wrong choices, carry consequences for generations. In heaven, the angels who had witnessed the destruction watched everything in silence. Their mission was accomplished, but God's heart didn't celebrate the destruction. His justice was perfect, but it was also filled with sorrow because the Creator takes no pleasure in the death of wicked people. He'd rather see them turn around and choose life. At that same time, in other parts of the earth, kingdoms were forming, men were exalting themselves, towers were being built, and empires were being born from human pride. Sodom and Gomorrah became legends, warnings, shadows in the memories of nations. But few people understood the real reason for their destruction. It was much more than just immorality. It was the conscious rejection of good. It was pride mixed with violence toward weak people. It was oppression combined with a complete lack of remorse. God had waited patiently, warned them clearly, sent obvious signs, and finally executed perfect justice. Lot's descendants spread out, formed tribes, and became strong peoples. But the memory of that fiery destruction never completely left their lands. On quiet nights around campfires, tribal elders still told stories of how the sky once opened and rained down judgment. Abraham continued his journey of faith. Sarah would soon conceive the promised son, and their story would take a wonderful new turn. But the echo of Sodom and Gomorrah would keep resonating through Scripture, through the words of prophets, and through the warnings of nations until the time of the Messiah himself. Lot, on the other hand, disappears from the pages of sacred history after this. His life became a reflection of a righteous man who escaped with his life but lost everything valuable in the process. He became a symbol of salvation through God's mercy, but also a warning to those who flirt with worldly temptation. In the sands of time, winds began to blow again over the ruins, stirring up nothing but ashes. But between heaven and earth, perfect justice had been served. A few generations later, the name of Sodom was no longer spoken out loud in polite conversation. In tents, palaces, and mountain villages, parents told their children cautionary stories about people who challenged the Almighty and vanished from the earth. Prophets, centuries later, would raise their voices and declare, "Remember Sodom," and those words would send chills down people's spines. But there was something else happening behind the scenes. A seed was sprouting in the silence of history. Two descendants of Lot, despite their troubled origins, would have unexpected encounters with God's eternal plan. Among the Moabites, a woman named Ruth would be born. She would leave behind her people's idol worship to follow the God of Israel, becoming an ancestor of King David and, centuries later, of the Messiah himself. Even in the ruins of human failure, God's grace could still work miracles. Sodom had been consumed by fire, but the story didn't end in ashes. In the middle of divine judgment, mercy was still growing like flowers in a desert. It was as if behind the curtains of fire and smoke, an invisible thread was weaving together God's eternal plan of salvation. The cities of sin had fallen, but God's promise remained alive and unshakable. And now, far away from the destroyed valley, a baby boy was about to be born, a child of promise, a son whose name meant laughter. Isaac was coming into the world. The time to laugh would arrive, but the memory of crying would never be completely forgotten. Time passed like sand through an hourglass. The dust of destruction was carried away by desert winds, but the memory of Sodom and Gomorrah remained carved in scripture and human hearts. The ashes of divine judgment became an eternal symbol of God's perfect justice. The prophets would never stop using these cities as warnings to their people. The Lord himself, in future centuries, would point to these cities as examples of final judgment. But right there in the heart of the desert, while the world moved forward in its own ways, Abraham witnessed another part of God's promise being fulfilled. Sarah had conceived and given birth to a son. Abraham named him Isaac because Sarah had laughed when she first heard the promise. And now everyone could laugh with her. The birth of this boy brought light to their tent and hope to a story that had been marked by trials and miracles. The God who judges with perfect justice is also the God who fulfills promises with perfect faithfulness. While new life was blooming in Abraham's family, the memory of the devastated cities became a necessary contrast to understanding God's holiness. Even so, the world hadn't changed much. Nations were still exalting themselves, peoples were still getting lost in their pride, and Lot's descendants, the Moabites and Ammonites, were beginning to take shape as established peoples with their own territories. They built cities, erected altars to foreign gods, and inherited not only Lot's bloodline but also the scars of their traumatic origin. As expected, conflicts with Abraham's descendants wouldn't be long in coming. The promised lineage and the wounded lineage would walk side by side through history, sometimes in peace, but often in war. From heaven, the Most High watched it all. His justice remained firm, his mercy remained extended, and his plan remained unshakable. Sodom had been judged, but it wasn't the only city that deserved fire. Everywhere on earth the human heart remained corrupt and inclined toward evil. But the Lord remained patient, waiting for the right time, because in the end, even judgments point toward salvation. In Abraham's tent, Isaac grew under his father's watchful eyes. He was strong, curious, and full of questions about everything. At night, he would look up at the stars and ask, "Father, is this the same sky that God opened when he spoke to you?" Abraham would smile warmly, "Yes, my son, and it's the same sky that heard the cry of Sodom." "Does God still speak today, Father?" Abraham would look up thoughtfully and answer, He speaks always, my son, but not everyone wants to listen. The stories about the destroyed cities began to be told alongside the promises of the Almighty. Isaac would grow up knowing that the same God who destroys with justice also builds with love. And Abraham, now an old man but still full of faith, continued setting up stone altars wherever he traveled, reminding the world that there is one God over all nations, and no cry goes unheard before him. Once, Abraham took Isaac to the top of a hill where the wind blew stronger and the silence was deep and profound. From there, he pointed south toward the lands where the valley cities had once stood. There were Sodom and Gomorrah, he said simply. Isaac frowned with curiosity. What happened to them, Father? Abraham replied in a serious voice. They were consumed because they forgot God, because they chose evil and called it good, because they heard the cries of righteous people and responded with mockery. Could God destroy them again? Abraham knelt down in front of his son, placed his weathered hand on the boy's shoulder, and replied carefully, "The same God who judges perfectly is also the one who forgives completely. He gives time, he gives signs, he sends messengers. But when people choose to reject the light and embrace darkness, judgment must come." Isaac remained silent, absorbing every word as if he was carving an eternal secret into his soul. In the years that followed, Abraham's descendants multiplied like the stars he'd been promised. Nations rose, peoples fought wars, kings came to power and fell from grace. But the name of Sodom remained like an ancient scar, like a name that was dangerous to use carelessly. Prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel would recall the example of the destroyed cities as warnings to their generations. Even in the New Testament, the apostles would use Sodom as a symbol of rebellion against God and unbelief in his truth. Abraham, now very old, was watching another sunset from his tent. The shadows stretched long across the mountains, and he could hear Isaac's laughter in the distance, a pure, joyful sound that carried the hope of a new era in God's plan. He stood up slowly and walked over to his stone altar. He lit the fire, closed his eyes, and prayed one final prayer. "Lord, may my descendants never forget your name. May the children of my children remember your faithfulness. Even if they fall, let them return to you. And may they never become like the lost cities that forgot your love." The sky turned golden at that exact moment, as if God himself was confirming Abraham's prayer. A gentle breeze passed between the tents, and a single star shone brightly in the southern sky, right over the place where Sodom and Gomorrah had once stood. The story of fire and mercy was complete, but its echoes would ring through eternity, because when heaven falls as fire, it's never just about destruction. It's always about the choice between light and darkness, between humble faith and prideful rebellion, between the God who saves and the world that destroys itself. That's the lesson Abraham learned, that's the warning Lot embodied, and that's the truth that still transforms hearts today. God's justice is real, but his mercy is greater. His patience has limits, but his love has none. And in the end, even the ashes of judgment can become the soil where new life grows. This ancient story still speaks to us because the choice is still ours. Will we be like Abraham, following God's voice even when it leads us into the unknown? Or will we be like Lot's wife, looking back at a world that God is calling us to leave behind? The fire of heaven is still real, but so is the mercy that pulls us to safety. If this story has stirred something in your heart, don't let it end here. Hit that like button to support biblical education that changes lives, and subscribe to Bible Breakdown Hub for more truths that have the power to transform your faith journey. Because in a world that often looks like Sodom, we need to remember the God of Abraham, the one who judges with perfect justice and saves with perfect love.